because the world at the moment is such that human beings in it behave very like children in the kindergarten, fighting over toys. I mean, this is why we still do national, devastatingly stupid things like fight wars and kill one another. And then, these conflicts that we see in the world are marks of immaturity and failure. So really, we're at a very, very early stage in development.
What does it mean to be human? Is it found in our breath, the beat of our hearts, or in the fleeting moments of joy and sorrow? We are fragile beings in a vast universe. What does it mean to be conscious, to wonder? We are explorers of our little world and of ourselves. In this series, we look into this internal exploration, questions with no right answers, only ideas of what it is like to be human, to express what can hardly be explained. We aim to send these explorations beyond our planet, into the furthest reaches of the galaxy. What will the finders of these messages make of our voices, of our questions? Will they see us as we see ourselves? Perhaps, too, they are searching, as we are, as humans.
Up at the stars, I'm struck by the immensity of space, the enormous depths which those sources of light lie, at the sense of the antiquity of the universe, given that the light reaching my eyes has taken so long to get there. I'm conscious also of the fact that this realization of just how vast the universe is and how insignificant our own galaxy, let alone our own solar system or planet is a very recent one. In fact, I had occasion to write some time ago about an experience had by two savants of the 17th century who were able to witness a transit of Mercury across the face of the sun by looking at a card on which the sun was reflected and seeing a little dot creeping across the face of the card, and being aware of the fact that this was a planet out there in space. And very, very, just a few decades before, people were in general convinced that the universe is geocentric, that we were at the center of things, that this great display of lights in the heavens was arranged for our benefit, and that somehow or other we were at the pinnacle of an important story. And so this great reversal in the 17th century really reconfigured the position of humanity in the universe, reshaped it entirely. The next step, of course, was Darwin, which put it in a different place in the great tree of life also. But this idea of just how vast space is, how ancient it is, how little we are in it, is a source of not of fear, not of a kind of overwhelming existential sense of triviality, but of the sort of majesty in a way of the human mind, because it's able to grasp that, able to penetrate it. A tremendous discovery and a great reconfiguring of what we are and where we are in space and time. Human, well, I mean, there's the obvious biological, primatological conception of us. We're an ape. We happen to be rather scantier clad with hair than most of our cousins on that family tree. So in some very basic and banal sense, the fact of being human should not make us too exceptionalist or feel too special. We are part of nature. And we are learning now that we're not that different from the rest of nature. Intelligence, consciousness, awareness of the world, sentiment, love and grief, these things are present. We see them in nature, so they're not distinctive of us. But we do seem to have them in a pretty acute degree, some of these things. And importantly, we're able to communicate them. So we do have language. We have a a symbolic and signaling system of very, very much greater complexity than any other creatures in the world, so far as we know. Perhaps dolphins and the rest of them are quoting poetry to one another, but generally speaking, we think it's us. And our ability to record things, to communicate things, to pass things on to other generations, to formulate new thoughts, new conceptions, because of the power that language gives us, reaches very deeply into us, and in the sense that it forms or shapes our sensibilities. And so our capacity to love and to grieve, to inquire, to sense the mystery of things, to rejoice at discovery. I mean, all the things that we value in our experience, together with the things that make us alert to the harms that we can do and the suffering that can be experienced in life by the tragedies of life. All these things make us complex, interesting, complicated, and sometimes rather despicable creatures. And in all these respects, at any rate, our humanness turns out to be something so embrangled with itself, so complicated. But it is no surprise that whole literatures are devoted to the exploration of what this thing is, what is human nature, and how do we understand the human condition. And there is no pat answer for either of those. One of the last great frontiers, both in philosophy and in science, is understanding the sources of consciousness, what it is, in what sense it is instantiated in physical processes in central nervous systems, human and otherwise. There are lots of theories. The most popular one at the time that we are speaking is that perhaps, some quantum phenomena in the microtubules in neurons of the brain might be responsible for it. And when I hear that, of course, I'm immediately reminded of the fact that in the 17th century, people thought the universe was a kind of clockwork. In the 19th century, they thought the central nervous system was like a telephone exchange. That von Daniken thought that as soon as spaceflight became possible, that the gods must be visitors from outer space. So, we're always tempted to use whatever the current available model is to try and explain something. And at the moment, quantum theory is, what it's able to drive a lot of energy production and create huge bonds and super fast computers. So we think, well, this might be the model that explains consciousness. We know something about what consciousness does in providing externally directed awareness and internal awareness. We identify as one of the biggest problems in understanding consciousness the fact that it feels like something to be in pain or in love or hungry or cold and so on. And we can say certain things about the evolutionary advantages of this, so we know what work is done by it. But how it is we have it, how widespread it is in nature, and how it's generated by what appear to be causal material things remains. We require a shift of perspective on where we as a species, humanity, is and where our planet is in the grand scheme of things in the following way. That because we occupy the advancing limit of all time, so far as we know, that has elapsed to this point, we kind of think of ourselves as being, the most developed, most advanced, the most something or other, up to this point. The change of perspective we need is to see that, in fact, we are probably really rather primitive. I mean, certainly, if you look at the human body and its evolved condition, all sorts of things like the appendix and the disposition of the organs of the evacuation and generation being in close proximity, and so on, we don't seem to be all that well designed, and we might, if another few million years are granted us, if we can survive this century in which we are speaking, then we might change a great deal. But certainly our societies might change. because the world at the moment is such that human beings in it behave very like children in the kindergarten, fighting over toys. I mean, this is why we still do national, devastatingly stupid things like fight wars and kill one another. And then, these conflicts that we see in the world are marks of immaturity and failure. So really, we're at a very, very early stage in development. And if we think about what we are pleased to describe as civilization, we only go back to something like 3,000 or 4,000 years BCE. And even indeed, the period earlier than 1000 BCE was only discovered or rediscovered in the middle of the 19th century when archaeology really got going. So actually, we're at a very early stage of things. And getting to this early stage has itself taken an enormous amount of development, because if you think of the 100,000 years of, anatomically and culturally modern humans before the Neolithic period, you see how very, very slowly we adapted and developed through using technologies and art and so on. So I think we're primitive. We're still at a very young stage. We may, out of our immaturity, end ourselves before we get a chance to mature properly. And so if we were to put together something which some civilization 10,000, a million years hence looked at it, what they would be seeing would be, a rather uneducated and poor version of the Flintstones in almost every respect, not just of technology, but of social development and intellectual maturity. One preliminary, which is in all my animate versions about the rather primitive and immature nature of humanity, that there are, of course, and have always been those who have striven, who try to encourage us to grow up and be more sensible. And this couldn't be more important an endeavor in connection with the now inevitable reach of humanity into space, because we have already begun a scramble for accessing resources out there in space, on the moon, asteroids, Mars, before the end of this century, almost certainly to form bases out there in space with human beings, not just robots in them. Colonies, perhaps colonization of the moon and Mars. That might be followed by colonization of some of the moons of Jupiter. I don't know. There might be, over the next couple of centuries anyway, a great expansion of human presence in our solar system. And if that is so, then we have to ask the question right now: what seeds are we planting for what those future human habitations in space will look like? Because if those habitations are constructed by, let us say, Elon Musk's company or by the Chinese, then the seeds we will be planting for the form of the society that grows from them will be very different from a form of society which is planted with concepts of the rule of law, human rights, civil liberties, and so on, of the kind that the United Nations is always very ambitious to encourage people to adopt. This is why, actually, in a recent book about activity on the moon and the near solar system, I've argued that we really ought to have in place good frameworks for the development of humanity's future. There should be international agreements about what form they will take, how any conflicts or disagreements out there will be resolved and adjudicated. So what structures there would be in place so that as colonies grow, and eventually, of course, as colonies always do become independent in the future, so that we can avoid the H.G. Wells War of the Worlds scenario from being what we bequeath to our descendants, then we ought to do it properly and sensibly. And we're not doing it at the moment. We're leaving space to be a Wild West, for a scramble of private companies and state actors anxious really to make profits out of space, or to get first mover advantage, or to be militarily the first presence in space and so on. And this reprises the kindergarten aspect of human beings. And it seems to me that now that we are moving out into space, this is inevitable. It's going to happen. That's where the future of humanity lies. We should try to do it in a rational, mature, well-ordered kind of way to take the opportunity to do better in space than we've done on our own planet. Well, I take a very Aristotelian view about this, which is that the reason that Aristotle's writings on ethics and his writings on politics were regarded by him as writings on the same subject was because he recognized that good individual lives can only be fully realized in a good social order. So, meaning a social order in which people are secure from the depredations of others who are stronger or more aggressive than they, but also which opens the space around them for the personal development of all the very many different and diverse ways in which people can find satisfaction and creativity and meaning in life. Because there is not a one-size-fits-all answer to the question, what is a good life? What is a good human life? A good human life is fundamentally one that is chosen and which is consistent with the good of others. It doesn't interfere with others' search for a life that is worthwhile and meaningful to them individually. But it is one where a degree of autonomy, this is why things like the human rights of privacy and choice and conscience and being able to meet up with other people freely and to have a family life and some personal property and so on. This is why these things matter. It's so that each individual can, either as an individual or in relationship with certain others they care about, make lives that are good to live. But that needs a kind of social structure that respects that. This is why I'm a believer in democracy. I hope one day there will be democracy somewhere in the world, and such a thing would be predicated on the idea that political and social structures exist to serve the rights of individuals, that they don't exist for individuals to serve them, which unfortunately is too much the idea in some dispensations. We take a sort of classic definition of democracy. So what Abraham Lincoln said in his Gettysburg Address, a government of the people, by the people, for the people, that is a very, very nice encapsulation of the idea. And in particular, the middle one, by the people, is an indication of where we think the source of authority and legitimacy in a state lies, namely in the will of the people collectively. But the minute that you begin to dig into the weeds of this a little bit, so even if you just look at the Lincoln definition, government of the people, yes, that's all the people. So that's men, women, children, slaves, free, absolutely everybody. That's fine. By the people, well, at the time that Lincoln spoke, the only people who had the vote were white males who owned property. So the people there was a very, very restricted percentage of the people. And then for the people, well, unfortunately, the way quote-unquote democracies have developed is that they have become, riddled with party politics. And so government for the people tends to be government for the people who donate money to your party or who vote for you. So, you're really serving that moiety of the population who will get you re-elected next time. So the word people and each of its three occurrences in the Lincoln definition means something different. And this is why we haven't ever had democracy in full, because of course the more populous countries become, the more difficult it is for everybody to get together as they might in a village, or to discuss and to decide collectively. So you have to have representatives, you have to have institutions, and then you get people who learn how to operate those institutions for the benefit of one partisan view rather than another. And the result is that what we call democracies are in fact oligarchies. The oligarchies in question are powerful party political organizations that know how to harvest votes and get their hands on the levers of power. So, this is a difficulty in our world. But of course, disaffection with democracy, which has been growing recently, because democracy of the kind, as I've just anatomized it, of course, doesn't meet the expectations of aspirations of their people. So there's a lot of disaffection with democracy for that reason. People get very fed up with the party politics. But there are other reasons. Multinational business lies outside the power of democratic governments to do anything about them. And multinational business causes a huge amount of depredation on the environment and on people, on labor. It's also the case that there's interference by anti-democratic forces, both within and outside democracies, to undermine them. Interference, propaganda, weaponized now by social media platforms, which target and convey misinformation or propaganda. And so that's another attack on democracies. And finally, in the 3 or so decades after the Second World War, many countries around the world either became or claimed to be democracies. Now, we can leave aside, for example, places like the People's Democratic Republic of North Korea, where, the use of the word was merely cosmetic. But a lot of countries sought to become democracies or quasi-democracies because they thought that North America and Western Europe provided a kind of model of success economically and socially and so on that they wanted to imitate. But with the sort of faltering of these democracies, exposed really by the advent of social media and what that effect that's had on elections like 2016, Trump and the Brexit referendum and other disasters, the model that seems more attractive now is the authoritarian state, which is economically very successful, China. And that's a very different way of thinking about how to organize the society. So we're living at a time now when, the democratic moment in human history might be coming to an end. After all, it was only achieved very recently, just in, the last couple of centuries. And all the ideas associated with it, very valuable ideas, by the way, because even in imperfect democracies, a regime of rule of law, of civil liberties, of human rights, it's something which people now take for granted and therefore, and which are therefore invisible to them. So in their disaffection with democracy, they don't quite realize what baby they're going to be chucking out with the bathwater. But those things were very, very, very hard won. It took centuries to get those liberties, those advantages, women's rights, working people's rights, employment rights, the right to have a vote, the right not to be coerced into what you're going to believe, or being in effect the conscript of an absolute monarch or something. Mm-hmm. Living in a democracy is tiring. After all, democracies are noisy. It's lots of argument, disagreement, criticism, and striving, and conflict, and so forth. And that's saying that the price of liberty is eternal vigilance, or as I would say, eternal engagement. Really does make a demand of people that they think and choose and find out and get involved. Whereas tyranny is silent and on the surface of things rather peaceful. That's because people aren't allowed to argue and debate and quarrel. And if you're prepared to just go along with it, then of course you can be reasonably peaceful, but at a huge cost. The cost of your society being a stagnant, banal, shallow place where there's no kind of artistic or literary or philosophical creativity, where to submit to the dictates of a cabal or ruler is the price you pay for, the sort of bread and circuses that the rulers will offer you in order to keep you quiet. And that seems to be since it isn't to live fully and humanly, living fully and humanly is making choices and doing tough things and that's trying to create meaning. How well said it is that the meaning of life is that you have to seek meaning and create it, and on an individual level, not just by accepting some, pre-cooked version of what makes a meaningful life, like a religion or an ideology or something, but to do the work yourself. And to be denied the opportunity to do the work is a terrible thing. I mean, plenty of people don't take the opportunity, but it should be there. As things stand at the moment, capitalism has become, like the cuckoo in the nest, it's become so overwhelming in its structures and institutions and powers that it is actually an enemy of democracy. I mentioned earlier on that multinational corporations lie outside the competence of any one state to do anything about them and to constrain their activity. They are now such powerful players, and they have been, great partners in fostering the sequestration of trillions of dollars of value in the world into offshore, accounts and so on. So these great big corporations pay hardly any tax. They therefore deprive countries, especially developing countries, of a lot of resource for their development. And they are great engines of social injustice and inequality. They funnel vast amounts of wealth into very few hands at the expense, at the cost of huge numbers of people. They allow a situation to prevail in which people can live in the most conspicuous luxury in their penthouses, where there are people sleeping on the street below them in all weathers. I mean, this kind of thing is so ethically horrific that you begin to wonder how it is that what seemed like a pretty good idea. So let's have an open market where people can buy and sell and trade, where people could get together to pool their resources to, create a business and get a return for their energy and their creativity. And all this seems fine. I mean, personally, I don't think there's anything wrong with being rich. I'd quite like to be rich myself, providing it wasn't at the expense of other people having to be poor. But that's how capitalism has turned out. And capitalism has become an engine so relentlessly driven by one value, that is the bottom line, profit, getting profit, that so many other things are just simply swept aside or crushed underfoot by this relentless process. And it's precisely because these engines, profit-seeking engines, have now become so vast and multinational that they have escaped our ability to restrain them and constrain. And this is damaging the world. It's damaging democracy. Indeed, how, the very smart guys in China have recognized that they can use all the instruments of capitalism without any of the advantages of social and political liberalization that naively people used to think half a century ago would be inevitable. If China became capitalist, it would become quote unquote free. Not a bit of it. And this just unmasks the fact that the great, economic leviathan of capitalism is not interested in the individuals it sells to or the individuals it uses to make its profits. I had occasion to write a rather elaborate disquisition on the many concepts of time that we employ in our different discourses. That there isn't one single concept of time available to us, but we think about time in different ways depending upon our interests. So, for example, we're conscious of the fact that subjective time varies. Two people can go to the opera. For one who's loving it, it flashes by. For the other who's hating it, it creeps and crawls endlessly. So we have to try to annex subject times together. So we choose some public feature like the apparent passage of the sun or whatever, and then we use that. I'll meet you at the pub at 5 o'clock tomorrow afternoon so we can manage that. And then we think about longer periods of time. So we extrapolate public time back indefinitely, ... and forward indefinitely, ... But indefinite time is not eternity. Eternity literally means outside time, so time doesn't apply to it. Or infinite time, what sense can we make of that? I mean, language is full of tricks that enable us to think that we're thinking something when actually we're not, because we can't get our heads around it. So then we talk about infinite time. Then we need, for finer and finer and finer purposes, especially in scientific research, we need ways of calibrating time that are much, much more accurate. So we take the radioactive decay of the cesium-123 atom or something like that and use that, or rather it's the oscillations in it of the cesium atom that we use in order to measure time. Now, all these different uses of the concept of time don't correlate very easily or naturally with one another, or all the less so when we notice that when we talk about experience time, clock time, historical time, we're actually doing is we are of necessity making use of spatial metaphors. A long time ago, short time, nearly at the same time. All these are actually spatial metaphors, and we can't dispense with metaphors in thinking about time. And when you say to somebody, how far away is the airport? And they say half an hour. So there you're using time as a measure of distance. Whereas if you were in the desert and you say, well, how far is it from A to B? They would say, 50 kilometers, or they wouldn't say it's an hour, because of course the conditions are different. In a city, to get to the airport, the kilometers are an irrelevance because of the traffic and the traffic lights and so on. So, we mix these things up in order to manage our sense of space and time around us. And when we dig into them and examine them, we see that they're all sort of metaphorical. They're all just bits of conceptual elastoplast and chewing gum. They don't really have anything very precise. And when we do precify them, then we're not talking about the same thing at all. Because if I said to you, meet me at and then I gave you some vast number of the oscillation of the cesium atom, that would be completely useless to you. Death is an interesting subject, because of course it's inevitable, and of course, and some people are, horrified by the idea of it. Some people wonder whether there is anything on the other side of death, any kind of conscious existence, disembodied or otherwise, on the other side of death. But from a philosophical point of view, and again, this is something that I've had occasion to dilate on at length, I think it's important to notice that death is nothing to us individually, because we never experience it. It's not part of our experience. We experience death as the death of others, so we experience it as grief and loss. That's what death is. It's grief and loss relative to other people. We do experience dying, but you have to be alive to die. And dying might be a pleasant experience or it might be an unpleasant experience. Woody Allen once famously said he's not scared of death, he just doesn't want to be there when it happens. And that kind of sums up the idea of how nasty it might be actually trying to go the experience of dying. I think that the fact that we will die, that is an inevitability, should be regarded as a sort of positive, because it provides a kind of frame. It reminds us that we have to focus our endeavors to achieve that meaning, or to reconcile ourselves with the things that we are not reconciled with, and the people that we haven't reconciled with, before we're caught up. There's this wonderful Swedish book called The Book of Swedish Death Cleaning, which is all about tidying up your flat or house or something before you die so that other people don't have to do it. And this can be generalized to the sense of how we make sense of lives, because the ultimate sort of death cleaning process is to eventually become wise. As Epictetus said to his students every day, he says to them, how long will you delay to be wise? And then there was some elderly man who was a member of his class and said, oh, it's too late for me, I suppose. And Epictetus said, no, even in the last hour of a very long life, it is possible to be wise. And what that would mean is coming to a sense of grasp of who you are, and what really matters to you. and how through most of your life you've been distracted from what really is worthwhile by all the trivialities that we surround ourselves with all the time. So death would help us to focus on that. And from that point of view, death is a valuable thing. Truth is a complicated one, mainly because in all the different discourses we engage in, but by discourse I mean a sort of system of thought and talk that makes use of a family of concepts which themselves endow meaning on what we say and think. So, when we're talking about ordinary perceptual experience, and I say there is the screen of a laptop before me now, then what I mean when I say that's true is that it's something I can see or verify in the moment. When I say lying is, socially destructive in many cases, there I'm offering something as a moral truth. But what we mean by truth in that case is not that I can see it. It is rather that I can provide some kind of justification for it in a story I tell about social relationships. If I say that 1 + 1 = 2, and that statement is true in arithmetic to the base 10, then so somebody will say, well, what makes it true is not because I can see it or because it's socially justified, but because I can provide a proof of it. So you notice that suddenly the expression true has been translated into can be verified, can be socially justified, can be proved. And it means 3 different things in 3 different discourses. So in my philosophical work, I always say that one should or always go for the more precise expression that we intend to convey by the use of the word true, which is defined by the context in which it's used. And it will turn out to be different in each of those contexts. In science, if you got hold of a self-respecting physicist, and most of them are, and said, do you know anything? Is there anything which is true in science? Other than in the sort of colloquial way in which we talk about the contents of a reputable encyclopedia constitute knowledge and what it offers us of facts and the facts are true. Then in all those cases, knowledge, fact, truth, that they're all used in a sort of colloquial sense to mean our best, evidence to our best understanding of these things. That's what's going to count as knowledge in the encyclopedia until we discover something new, better, or something else. Okay. So the physicist will say, no, I don't know anything and I don't claim any truths, but I do have extremely powerfully evidenced support for some of the things that we postulate in science, and on which we can therefore rely in our further work, in further inferences, as a basis for further discovery. And in science, for example, Physics Review Letters, which is the top physics journal, says that it will treat as a discovery in science anything of sigma 5 or above, where sigma 5 is a mark of how improbable it is that the results in that experiment was the result of an error or something wrong with the equipment and so forth. So in fact, we don't know anything. We just have very rationally justified beliefs. The reason why you can claim in the colloquial sense to know, and therefore that it is true that there are no fairies at the bottom of your garden, is that you have extremely little evidence in favor of that and a huge amount of evidence against it. So really, instead of talking about truth and knowledge, we should talk about rational belief. And we should concentrate on that word rational, the first part of which is ratio, which means proportion. And therefore, a rational belief is one which is proportional to the evidence that you have for it, strength of the evidence and the power of the arguments that you can adduce. If you think in these terms about rational belief, about evidence, about reasoning, about the fact that all our empirical claims about the world in science and in ordinary life are defeasible, that is, they might be wrong. It might turn out that there's a better theory. And the history of science tells us that we're very often finding that what we think is actually only a special case or part of a bigger picture. So these claims are defeasible, and it is part of rationality to be open to the probability or to the possibility that we might be proved wrong, and therefore we must change our minds. I mean, it's dogma that doesn't change its mind. It's science which is open-minded and which says, prove me wrong. Wants to be shown how to improve itself. So get rid of knowledge and truth and think instead of rational belief and a very, very responsible inquiry. I'm a little tempted to be wary in thinking about the concept of information as it's applied now, for example, in claims that the universe is a sort of matrix of information or something. I'm a little inclined to be wary in the same way as I'm wary about the 17th century analogizing of the universe with clockwork, because the fact that it is that you can represent something as information. So, for example, supposing you're on Mars and you want to put up on the wall of your room in Mars and the Mona Lisa. So I send you an image of the Mona Lisa as a series of noughts and ones, which you can reconstitute and produce the picture up there on Mars. This might make you think, well, the picture of the Mona Lisa is actually just a lot of noughts and ones. Well, the fact is it can be represented as such. You could give an extremely precise matrix of numbers to capture the pixels that constitute the picture, the actual hue, saturation, tonality of the color of that particular point on the canvas. But to go from being able to represent something in an informational form to saying it is information is a big step. So that would be one source of skepticism about it, I suppose. However, there's no harm in thinking in terms of synonyms. So there is a sense in which you could say that what DNA is just is something that encodes information which, interpreted or unwrapped, would result in the expression of certain structures in a living body, in a plant or a cow or something. And so that's fine. And in fact, that's rather a powerful way of thinking about it. But whether we should, wax metaphysical and say that everything is information, what one has done is one's pushed the question on. It's a bit like saying the universe was created by God, and then you say, well, where the hell was God come from, and what does it consist of? I was saying, what is information, and what form does it take? I mean, is there some abstraction of the language in which we express information now? So, digital code, for example, is there some abstraction of that would explain what information truly is in its ultimate nature, if its ultimate nature is the ultimate nature of all things? It's an old perennial, this great question, is there a meaning of life? And whenever I'm asked it, because people find out that I teach philosophy or I'm a professor of philosophy, they say, well, what is the meaning of life? I say, I know the answer to that question, not because I found it, but because the philosophical tradition offers us it. And I'd already mentioned it. The meaning of life is that you are to create meaning. The meaning of your life is the meaning that you give it. And that might be very different from the meaning that somebody else gives to his or her life. It's an individual thing. The big mistake made is that there is something external, like, for example, the dictates of a deity or something, which imposes or confers or provides meaning, as if there was this one-size-fits-all answer that ignores the diversity of character and talent and possibility, situation, historically and otherwise, that individuates people. The Delphic oracle had over it the adjuration to know oneself, and naturally enough, be able to seek and create meaning in one's life, one's own personal life, out of one's choices and endeavors, requires that one knows something about one's talents and inclinations, and some self-understanding is necessary for that. So that would be part of the creation of meaning. And then again, it has been pointed out that even as you set out to find out what would really give you a sense of meaning, a sense of satisfaction, even as you take the first steps into already living a meaningful life because you are in search of meaning. Now, famously, Albert Camus wrote an essay, The Myth of Sisyphus, which he talks about this mythological person who, punished by the gods, has to roll a boulder up a hill but will never get it to the top. It will always roll back down again, and he's condemned to do this for the whole of eternity. And Camus asks the question, could Sisyphus nevertheless regard his existence as meaningful? And he gives the answer, yes, he can. He can invest meaning in it. You might ask how? Well, he might consider it as being, his resolve to defy the gods or not to be overwhelmed by the task that has been set him or something else, but that it is open to him in his ultimate freedom to choose, even in this absurd situation with the boulder, to make his existence meaningful. But it is a personal thing. I mean, Socrates is said to have remarked that an unconsidered life, a life not thought about and chosen, is not worth living, because living it conforms to somebody else's idea of what your life should be. It isn't your own. And this is the very subversive idea that underlies that simple remark. Because if you see that it is the individual's own responsibility to create a meaningful life, to live one, choose it, to do things that are meaningful himself, then that is a repudiation of the idea that, the church or the synagogue or the mosque or whatever can tell you what the meaning of your life is and how you must live it, what you must do to get whatever reward is offered for living according to that prescription. The reward for the self-created, the life made meaningful by one's own choices, is the life itself. Well, future humans, especially humans quite a long time in the future from where we are now, will find most intriguing, among the other things like our quaintness and our stupidity and our ignorance and the primitiveness of our science and so on. But they will find most interesting, I think, our expectations of what we think future humans might be and of our hopes of what we hope future humans might be. Well, I think when one considers that attempts at prophecy, attempts at trying to describe what the future might be, when one remembers what people said before the First World War about heavier than air flight, they said that because biplanes fly better than monoplanes, the airplanes of the future will have 12 wings. Oh, this just shows the absurdity of prophecy. And it has been well said that prophecy is risky, especially when it comes to the future. But one can have expectations or hopes at any rate. And my hope is that people, human beings, our descendants, if we have any, and we live in a very dangerous century, we have the technology and the cleverness to destroy ourselves, but we don't have the wisdom or the maturity not to destroy ourselves. So we're at a very dangerous moment in human history. But if we survive it, then I hope that our descendants will be beings who have a real opportunity to develop all those aspects of creativity, the potential for innovation, the penetration of the fascination and beauty of our universe in a very full and rich way. That, the aesthetic dimensions of life, the situation in which people live together in a completely relaxed, friendly and secure kind of way, the causes of conflict are rid of. There's all our old superstitions and prohibitions and anxieties will no longer exist. But free minds enjoying their existence in this universe of ours. That would be my hope. Now, that sounds a little too much like heaven. And then there are people who say how awful it would be to be in heaven just singing hymns all the time. And what I've just described sounds a little bit like that. Because, challenge, difficulty, grist to the mill, the sort of possibility of growing because one does hard things, one accepts challenges and so on. That seems to be important. But I hope that our descendants, these future humans, will find challenging and exciting, the further reaches of mathematics and physics, and perhaps some of the very deepest of the recurrent philosophical problems that any generation would have to examine and discuss, but would also, in their freedom to be creative, would produce and not rely on ChatGPT or AI or something to do it for them, but works of art and of literature and of music and other delights that add to the little richness, the little treasure that we have at the moment managed to create in